There are some stories in the Bible that feel like they belong on a stained glass window, right? Like Moses at the burning bush, Mary meeting the risen Jesus, Isaiah seeing the temple filled with smoke. Big cinematic moments when you can, there should be a soundtrack swelling behind this moment. And then there's tonight's story, which is about a guy who borrows an axe and loses it in a river. Which means apparently the Bible has room for both these huge cosmic encounters and the ancient equivalent of dropping your friend's power tool in Chatfield Reservoir, which is comforting and also weirdly stressful. Because if you've ever borrowed something from someone and then immediately broke it or lost it or scratched it or dented it or returned it while hoping, just please don't ask too many questions, you already understand kind of the emotion of this passage. This is week 2 of Off the Record, Volume 2, our series through more of the weird, forgotten, misunderstood stories in the Bible. We're giving attention to the stories that are easy to skip because they seem too strange or too small or too funny or just too confusing to bother with. But the longer we sit with them, the more they start telling the truth about our real lives. Last week we talked about Balaam's donkey, who somehow became the most emotionally mature creature in that scene. That story wasn't mainly about a magical animal or a prophet having a very bad day. It was about the way grace can arrive through the very voice or delay or inconvenience that we're tempted to dismiss too quickly. Sometimes the thing slowing us down is worth listening to before we decide that it's just in our way. Tonight, we're moving from that unexpected interruption on the road to an ordinary loss at a riverbank. It's kind of the same strange Old Testament energy, just a different kind of anxiety. Tonight's story is a lot smaller. There's no talking animal. There's no terrifying, semi-invisible angel with a sword like last week. This is just a story about work and responsibility and anxiety and borrowed equipment and the sinking feeling that comes when something you were counting on disappears. And that feels really appropriate. I've said this a lot lately, but most of life doesn't happen in the big, dramatic crises, thankfully. Most of life happens in the ordinary pressure of trying to be responsible. You're trying to pay the bills, you're trying to meet deadlines, you're trying to answer texts and emails, trying to return the thing you borrowed, finish projects, trying to keep your kids alive. It's summertime. You're trying to remember appointments, not forget passwords, and somehow still remember what you walked in the garage for. So tonight we're talking about a floating axe head. It's probably not a story you've heard before. I don't remember ever coming across this story before, and I've been reading this book basically since I could read. It's small, it's strange, and it's comically specific. And somehow it tells us something deeply kind about the attention of God. So let's just set the stage a little bit. This story is in the book of 2 Kings, which is part of the long story of Israel's monarchy after the nation has split into 2 kingdoms. There's Israel in the north and Judah in the south. It's a book full of kings, as the title implies, but also of political instability, violence, compromise, warnings, and the slow unraveling that eventually leads both kingdoms into exile. So big picture, 2 Kings is not exactly like a fun read. It's more like watching a nation ignore every flashing warning sign on the dashboard, which sometimes just feels a little too close to home. Elijah is one of the major prophets in this story. He follows the famous and powerful Elijah and his ministry, whose ministry was full of strange, earthy, practical miracles. Elisha does all these amazing things. He purifies poisoned water. He helps a widow survive debt. He feeds people. He brings a child back to life. He comforts kings. And then here, in the middle of all that big, important prophetic work, is a seemingly insignificant little miracle that's just easy to gloss over. I think that's part of what makes this story so interesting. It sits inside a book where nations are rising and falling, kings are making disastrous choices, and history is moving towards exile. And somehow, the text slows down long enough to tell us about one worried worker and one lost tool. So this is 2 Kings chapter 6, just the first 7 verses. It says, "One day the guild of prophets came to Elijah and said, 'You can see that this place we're living under your leadership is getting cramped. We have no elbow room. Give us permission to go down to the Jordan, where each of us will get a log. We'll build a roomier place.' Elijah said, "Go ahead." One of them said, "Please, come with us. You don't get out of the work." He said, "Certainly." He went with them. They came to the Jordan and started chopping down trees. As one of them was felling a timber, his axe head flew off and sank into the river. "Oh no, master," he cried out, "and it was borrowed." The holy men said, "Where did it sink?" The man showed him the place. He cut off a branch and tossed it at the spot. The axe head floated up. "Grab it," he said. The man reached out and took it. That's it. The next verse is immediately a completely different story about completely different things, on to other adventures. I think the first thing to notice is just how ordinary this whole scene is. Elijah's with a group of his disciples, sometimes called the company or guild of prophets. They're living and learning together, and their current space has gotten too small. And so they come to Elijah with a practical problem. Hey, we need more space to live. That's the problem here. It's not, hey, the enemy is marching towards us. Not there's like fire coming from heaven. Not the nation is collapsing. Just we need more room. It's a building project. They're just saying, hey, we've outgrown the space and somebody needs to go cut timber. So let's all go. My lower back hurts already thinking about that. So they head toward the Jordan River to cut down the trees and build a bigger place. And one of the men working with an axe, the iron head of it flies off the handle and lands in the water. That's the crisis. A tool breaks. The important part of it sinks. And the worker cries out because it wasn't his. It's something he borrowed. It'd be so easy to shrug this off. It's just one axe head. It's one worker. It's one lost tool in one river. We have to ask ourselves, what is this seemingly insignificant story doing in here? Compared to the big sweep of Scripture, this story almost feels too small to preserve. And I think maybe that's part of the point. The Bible doesn't only tell us that God cares about resurrection and justice and freedom. It also gives us a story where God's care bends toward a guy who lost something he couldn't afford to replace. I don't know about you, but that often is really hard for me to believe. It's hard for me to believe that the little things in my life matter to God. And that's what makes this story so beautiful. It refuses to divide life into the stuff that's important enough for God, and then you're on your own with everything else. It doesn't tell us God only shows up when the stakes are dramatic enough. It gives us a small, strange miracle for an ordinary stress. And for a lot of us, ordinary stress is the neighborhood we live in. The small thing goes wrong and your whole nervous system acts like a building's on fire. Your car makes a sound it's never made before. Your rent goes up. Your laptop freezes right before a meeting. You miss a deadline. You get an email that starts with "per my last email," which is just always fun. Corporate speak for, are you illiterate? The story starts small because our lives are often small in exactly this way. They're full of little losses that don't look dramatic from the outside, but they make your stomach drop because you know what they might cost. So the worker's cry is important. He says, "Oh no, master, it was borrowed." That one line tells us everything about why this matters. He's not just upset because the tool is gone. He's upset because the tool belongs to somebody else. He's responsible for something he can't recover and may not be able to replace. In the ancient world, iron tools weren't cheap. They weren't cheap little objects sitting in a garage next to 2 or 3 other tools that you even forgot you owned. Iron was extremely valuable. A good axe head represented real money and real labor and someone's livelihood, probably. Losing one wasn't like misplacing a pen. It was closer to wrecking someone's work truck and you don't have insurance, which sounds terrifying. It being borrowed changes the emotional weight of this story. This is about debt and shame and responsibility. It's about a worker knowing that he's going to have to go back to whoever he borrowed the axe from and say, "So listen, funny story." Except that that's never a funny story when you're the one who has to deliver it. We know this feeling, right? It's the panic of being responsible for something you can't fix. It's the fear of disappointing someone who trusted you. It's the embarrassment of needing help with something that seems simple. It's that inner voice that says you should have known better. You should have been more careful. You should have had a backup plan. Today, we know psychologically that humans tend to experience loss much more intensely than equivalent gains. It's called loss aversion. Losing $100 feels infinitely worse than gaining $100 feels good. Our brains are wired to notice threats and protect resources and sound the alarm when something important slips out of reach, which totally makes sense for survival. But it can make ordinary living exhausting. A small loss can turn into a story about who we are, right? Like the lost tool becomes, I'm an irresponsible person. The missed deadline becomes, I'm failing. The awkward conversation becomes, I've ruined everything. The little thing doesn't stay little once shame gets a hold of it. That's why I think it's interesting that the worker just immediately tells the truth about what's going on. He doesn't pretend it's fine. He doesn't ignore it or excuse it. He doesn't stand at the riverbank and say, at least I'm learning resilience. He just cries out, it was borrowed. There's something honest and grounding about that. Like he brings the real concern into the open. He names that specific anxiety he's feeling. He doesn't spiritualize it. He tells Elijah what happened and why it matters. And that willingness sets the stage for the rest of the story. One of the sneakiest lies many of us carry is the belief that our small anxieties are too small, too insignificant to bring to God or to others. We tell ourselves we should save prayer for like the big serious stuff, the cancer diagnoses or death or divorce, addiction, violence, like big grief, big fear, big needs. And, to be clear, those things matter. Of course they do. We don't need to shrink the big suffering in order to make the room smaller for pain. But this story suggests God's compassion isn't rationed by category, right? God doesn't seem to be running a divine customer service line where your concerns have to meet some minimum crisis threshold before anyone picks up. I think that's part of what makes this passage interesting. The man doesn't lose a child. There's not a city at stake. There's not a battle. There's not a kingdom. He just loses a borrowed axe head. And Elijah takes him seriously. He doesn't mock him. He doesn't lecture him. He doesn't say, come back when you have a real problem. He just immediately asks him, where? Where did you lose it? That question is like so simple. Where did it fall? It's practical. It immediately takes this loss seriously. Where did it happen? Something about that feels important. This is a small example, but I think more broadly, it feels important because healing often begins when we can point to where things went wrong. Where did the peace go under? Where did the confidence sink? Where did the hope disappear? Where did the version of you who felt steady start slipping beneath the surface? Sometimes the most faithful answer we can give is painfully specific, like right there, that's where it happened, that's where it fell. There's a reason that kind of specificity helps us, because anxiety thrives in fog. It loves that vague dread, that hazy sense that everything is wrong and something terrible is probably coming. But when we name the actual concern, that fog starts to thin. I'm overwhelmed may be true, but sometimes the next honest sentence is, I'm overwhelmed because I don't know how I'm going to pay for this repair. Or I'm overwhelmed because I promised to deliver something at work and I don't know how to do it. Or I'm overwhelmed because everyone thinks that I'm handling this better than I really am. Saint Teresa of Avila was a 16th century Spanish mystic and writer, and very importantly for our purposes tonight, she was someone who refused to separate God's presence from ordinary work. She's attributed as having said, God walks among the pots and pans, which is so wonderfully grounded and exactly the kind of sentence that makes religious people either relax or get really nervous. But Teresa's point was that God isn't only found in quiet chapels or carefully worded prayers or these big, impressive spiritual moments. God's also found in kitchens and chores and daily tasks and the unglamorous work that nobody applauds. The axe head story that we're looking at tonight runs in that same direction. It tells us God isn't embarrassed by the ordinary. God isn't too grand for the practical. God's attention doesn't float above the daily stuff of homes and bills and work and tools and favors and responsibilities. God meets people at riverbanks with muddy hands and a problem that they're scared to admit out loud. That doesn't mean that every lost thing gets returned exactly the way we want, right? We know better than that. There are losses that stay lost. There are repairs that never happen. There are bills that still have to be paid and consequences that still have to be faced. Pain just doesn't just heal because we prayed sincerely. But this story insists that God's care reaches further into ordinary life than we often imagine it does. So Elijah asks where the axe head fell, and the worker shows him the place. And then Elijah cuts a stick and throws it into the water, and the iron axe head floats. That's the miracle. And yes, it's weird. Iron doesn't float. That's like one of iron's main things. It's heavy. This is one of those moments where the Bible gives almost no explanation. Like there's no speech, there's no thunder, there's no like big long ritual. Elijah doesn't gather everyone together and say, behold, like today I'm going to show you miraculous buoyancy. He just throws a stick into the river and the lost thing floats up. I love how understated it is. The story isn't pretending or even interested in explaining. It's not a manual called 7 Sticks to Recover Your Lost Blessing, which is probably something someone has preached somewhere because we just can't have nice things. The point isn't the stick. The point is the care behind the act. Still, the movement of this story feels familiar. Like something is lost, the person names it, the prophet asks where it fell, the place of loss is identified, then something impossible happens, and the worker is invited to reach out and take it. That last part in this already easy to ignore story is even easier to ignore. Elijah doesn't pick the thing up for him. He just says, grab it. So the man reaches out and takes it. The miracle restores possibility, and the worker still participates. He has to receive what's being given to him. I think that feels like a helpful picture of how grace often works. Like grace doesn't remove us from responsibility. Sometimes grace gives us back the capacity to take that next faithful step. It doesn't erase the work required from us. It helps us do it without being crushed. Some of us here, God cares about all the small things. All the small things. We hear that and we immediately assume it means that God will make every small thing easy. And yeah, I wish, truly. Like, I'd love a faith where every email gets answered and every bill pays itself and every awkward conversation just resolves itself. Oh man, that would make my life a lot easier. We want a situation where every lost item rose dramatically from the depths while a choir hummed in the background. But most of the time, grace looks far less like escape and a lot more like a little bit of help. Help to tell the truth. Help to ask for support. Help to stop spiraling. Help to make that phone call you've been dreading. Help to apologize. Help to face the consequences without letting shame narrate your identity. That's the kind of grace the story puts in front of us. The worker doesn't get shamed for losing the tool, he gets help. And then he reaches out, he takes what's been returned, and he presumably gets back to work. I think on the flip side, it's easy to hear God cares about all the small things and then wonder why your life feels so hard right now. Like, does God just not hear you? Does God just not like you? If he cares about all the small things, then what's the deal? What's the deal with my mess? And I've been there. Like, those are heavy questions. And if you're there right now, I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, usually in those times, I feel like I'm asking God a lot for help, but I'm not asking anybody else. I want God to help me solve my problem on my own. So I'm not asking for help, nor am I really looking for it from anyone else. This story reminds me that sometimes what I need to do is just swallow my pride and ask somebody for help. One of the last gifts of this story is that it treats work as a place where God is present. The prophets aren't in a temple service when this miracle happens. They're building. They're cutting down trees. They're using borrowed tools. Their hands are probably tired. Someone probably has sawdust in places sawdust should never go. A lot of us spend most of our lives doing things that don't feel especially sacred, right? Like you go to work, you answer messages, you care for people, you build spreadsheets, you fix engines, you teach kids, you schedule appointments, you change diapers, you go to meetings, you clean up messes, you make meals, you drive across town. You try to stay civil even when it's painfully clear no one's ever heard of zipper merging. I don't know why I've been talking about traffic so much. It's on my brain. It's easy to assume God is mostly interested in the obviously religious parts of life, right? Prayers and songs and scripture and Tuesday nights. And those things are good. They can shape us deeply. But if God only ever meets us there, most of our lives are left out. This tiny little story confronts that idea completely. God's care shows up on a work site. It shows up in a problem with a tool. It shows up in borrowed equipment and communal labor and a worker who's afraid he can't fix what just happened. That means your job, your responsibilities, your bills, your deadlines, your kitchen, your classroom, your caregiving, your repairs, and your ordinary Tuesday can become places where you can practice trust. Again, this doesn't make every task meaningful in some magical way. Some work is boring. Some work is unjust. Some jobs drain people, and we shouldn't sanitize that with religious, flowery language. We need to be honest about that. But even in the midst of ordinary work, God can meet us with attention and courage and wisdom and help. For the person who's carrying quiet anxiety about money, this story says your fear is seen. For the person who's trying to hold everything together, this story says your responsibility is seen. For the person who feels embarrassed because something small has just undone you, this story says your small thing isn't too small to bring into the open. So the invitation tonight is really simple. Bring the small thing forward. Bring the thing you've minimized because others have bigger problems. Bring the ordinary stress, the borrowed axe head, the responsibility, the fear, the thing you can't quite recover on your own. God's care doesn't become less real because the problem seems small to somebody else. So to help you sit with that truth a little while longer, I want to give you a few questions to carry into this week. Questions to help you name the place where something has slipped beneath the surface and ask what help might look like now. So the first is, what ordinary stress have you been tempted to believe is just too small to bring to God? The second is similar. Where are you carrying anxiety around responsibility or money or work or failure? And then finally, what small loss has started telling you a bigger story about yourself? This story about a floating axe head is weird, for sure. But if we stop long enough to get past the weirdness, it's beautiful. It tells us God's world has room for the person who says, I lost something I was responsible for, and I don't know what to do. It tells us that grace can meet us before shame turns one mistake into like our whole identity. It tells us that ordinary isn't outside God's attention. And maybe that's what some of us need to hear tonight. You don't need someone to tell you that your anxiety is silly. We don't need someone to compare our stress to everyone else's and rank it. We need the kindness of a God who asks, where did it fall? Where did the steadiness go? Where did the confidence sink? Where did the joy slip out of reach? Where did the shame start telling a story that sounded convincing but wasn't telling the whole truth? The good news of this odd little passage is that God's care reaches into the places we are tempted to minimize or to hide. The ordinary places, the embarrassing places, the place where we feel responsible and under-resourced. The places we're afraid to admit how much something small is affecting us. So bring the small thing. Bring the thing that feels too ordinary, too practical, too vulnerable, too work-related, too embarrassing, or too minor to mention. Bring it to the riverbank. Point to where it fell. And when grace gives you something to reach for, reach out and take it. May we trust that God's care reaches into ordinary life. May we have the courage to name where the loss happened. May we receive help without surrendering to shame. And may we return to our work with steadier hands, softer hearts, and a deeper trust that no part of our lives is unseen. Would you pray with me? God, it's so hard for me to sometimes believe that the little things that stress me out matter to you. God, thank you for stories that confront that. Thank you for forgotten stories that I've either never heard or glossed over my whole life that confront me with the truth that you care about my frustrations and my annoyances. You care about the things that I write off as being too small to bother me, even though they get at and start to speak to my identity. God, may we be people who don't hesitate to bring things that are too small to you. May we be people who are ready to ask for help. And may we be people who are ready to help others when they name the things that are in their way. God, we love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.